Hey, you, don't just stand there looking lost. I said, more wine.
I think you're mistaken.
Did I stutter? Get me a bottle of Cabernet now. Gosh, is nobody training the staff anymore?
Victoria glared at Julian, but he remained exactly where he was.
Did you hear me? Are you deaf? Listen, in this restaurant, when a guest asks for something, you don't just stand there staring at me like a fool.
With respect, I'm not part of your restaurant staff, ma'am.
Victoria Hillary had no idea the man she was trying to humiliate wasn't there to serve dinner. He was there to decide whether her company was worth $700 million. Julian Rivers stood near the bar at Hillary House, checking his phone. The restaurant buzzed around him. Waiters moved fast between tables. Glasses clinked. Somewhere a cork popped. He wasn't dressed like the other men in the room. No tie, just a dark jacket and a white shirt, open at the collar. He liked it that way. He liked being underestimated. He was waiting on Parker Vinton. Parker ran Vinton Capital, the fund that managed Julian's money, a lot of it. Parker had texted 20 minutes ago, running late. Grab a seat, I'll find you. So Julian waited by the bar, scrolling through emails, letting the noise of the room wash over him. That's when he felt it, a sharp snap, fingers cutting through the air. He looked up. A woman sat at a large round table a few feet away, surrounded by people in expensive clothes. Gold jewelry, perfect hair. She didn't look at Julian's face. Her eyes stayed on her wine glass, half empty, like it had personally disappointed her. More wine, she said. Flat. Bored. Like she was talking to a chair. Julian didn't move. He wasn't a waiter. He didn't work here. He had no idea who this woman thought she was talking to, but it clearly wasn't him. Not really. She hadn't even looked up. A few seconds passed. She noticed he hadn't moved. Her head snapped up. Her eyes locked onto him, annoyed now, like his stillness was an insult. She snapped her fingers again. Louder this time, sharper. Did you hear me? I said more wine. The people at her table turned to watch. A woman beside her covered a smile with her napkin. Julian still didn't move. He wasn't trying to make a scene. He just didn't know what she wanted him to do about it. That silence broke something in her. She stood up fast, chairs scraping against the floor. Heads turned across the dining room. Are you new? She snapped. Is that it? Nobody trained you? Because in my restaurant, when a guest asks for something, you don't just stand there staring at me like an idiot. Her restaurant. That word landed heavy in the air. Chop chop, she said, snapping her fingers a third time, right in front of his face now. I don't have all night. Get me a bottle of the Cabernet, and get it now, or I swear I will have you fired before dessert. The whole room had gone quiet. Forks stopped moving. A waiter near the kitchen door froze mid-step, tray balanced on his palm. A man in a black vest came hurrying over. Donald Owen, the floor manager. He'd seen the whole thing from across the room and moved fast, trying to get ahead of it before it got worse. Ma'am, Donald said, keeping his voice calm, careful. I think there's been a Don't ma'am me, she cut him off, whipping around to face him instead. Where do you people even find these people? Is this the level of staff you're hiring now? Because if my father saw this, saw the way this place is being run, he's not staff. Donald tried again, quieter, urgent. She didn't hear him, or she didn't care to. I want him gone, she said, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. Tonight. I don't care who he is. In this restaurant, you do not ignore a paying guest. Julian still hadn't said a word. Not one. He stood there, arms loose at his sides, watching her unravel in front of a room full of people who clearly knew exactly who she was, and had no idea who he was. She turned back to him, chest rising and falling, furious that he wasn't groveling, wasn't scrambling, wasn't apologizing. "Well?" she demanded. "Are you deaf or just stupid?" The dining room held its breath. Somewhere behind her, a woman at another table lowered her fork slowly, eyes wide, waiting to see what would happen next. Julian opened his mouth to speak for the first time. But before a single word came out, a voice cut through the silence from the entrance, rushed, breathless, and full of a very different kind of fear than the one Victoria was trying to put in him. "Mr. River?" Every head in the room turned toward the door. Parker Vinton came through the door at a near run, weaving between tables, his face pale and shining with sweat. He looked like a man who'd just seen his whole career flash before his eyes. "Mr. River, thank God," he said out of breath. "I am so sorry. Traffic was a nightmare. I was afraid you'd left." He stopped. He looked at Victoria, standing over Julian with her finger practically in his face. He looked at the frozen room. He looked at Donald, hovering nearby with his hands half raised, like he was trying to referee something that had already gone too far. Parker's face changed. The panic didn't leave. It just found a new target. "Victoria?" he said carefully. "What's going on here?" Victoria blinked, thrown off. This man was rude to me. I asked him for wine, and he just stood there, staring at me like—" "Victoria." Parker's voice dropped, but everyone at nearby tables still heard it. "This is Julian River." The name meant nothing to her. Her face said so. Parker kept going, and every word landed like a hammer. "Mr. River is the anchor investor in the fund that finances Hillary House's entire expansion. Every new location you've opened in the last 3 years, the capital for all of it came through him. $700 million, Victoria. He is not a waiter." The silence that followed wasn't like the silence before. That silence had been tense, waiting, hungry. This one was different. This one had teeth. Victoria's hand, still raised from her last furious snap, slowly lowered. Her mouth opened, then closed. Color drained from her face, then rushed back in a hot, humiliated red. Around her, the table she'd been hosting. Donors, board members, people she'd spent the whole night trying to impress, sat frozen, watching her realize exactly what she'd just done. A woman 2 seats down covered her mouth with her napkin, and this time it wasn't to hide a smile. Victoria started. "I didn't know." "No," Julian said. "You didn't." It was the first thing he'd said since she started yelling. His voice was calm, steady, not loud at all, which somehow made it worse for her, because everyone had to lean in a little to hear it, and that meant everyone was still watching. "I've been standing at this bar for 10 minutes, Julian said. "You looked right past me the whole time I waited here. Not once. Not even when you were yelling at me just now. You never actually looked at my face. You just saw somebody standing near your table, and you decided what I was worth before I said a single word." Victoria's jaw tightened. She had no answer for that, because there wasn't one. It was true, and everybody in that dining room knew it was true. Donald stood off to the side, quiet now, watching Julian with something like relief, and something like disbelief, too, that after everything, the man wasn't even raising his voice. Parker stepped in fast, desperate to move things along before the moment could get any worse for the fund's biggest client. "Mr. River, please, can we find a quieter table? We still need to go over the fund numbers." Julian nodded once. He wasn't interested in dragging this out. He wasn't interested in a scene, in an apology performed for an audience, in Victoria scrambling to fix her mistake in front of the same people she'd been trying to impress a minute ago. That wasn't the point for him. "Let's go," Julian said to Parker. He turned, and for 1 second his eyes passed over Victoria again. Not angry, not smug, just done with her. Then he walked toward the door Parker had come rushing through moments earlier. Victoria didn't say sorry. Not out loud. Not in front of her table. Her pride wouldn't let the word out, even now. Even after being caught so completely. She just stood there, hand still hovering near her wine glass, watching the man she'd humiliated walk away without a single crack in his composure. Parker hurried after Julian, throwing one last apologetic glance back at Victoria, a look that said we'll talk later, before disappearing through the door. The dining room stayed quiet a moment longer. Then, slowly, conversations picked back up, hushed and buzzing, every table now whispering about what they'd just watched. Victoria sank back into her chair. Her donors wouldn't meet her eyes anymore. Outside, the night air felt cooler than it had any right to. Julian stood on the sidewalk, while Parker fumbled with his jacket, still catching his breath from the panic of the last 10 minutes. "I am so sorry about that," Parker said. "Victoria can be. She's under a lot of pressure right now, with the expansion, the gala, all of it. That's not an excuse. It's not okay what she did. I want you to know that." Julian said nothing. He watched a cab roll past, its headlights sweeping across Parker's face. Parker kept talking, the way people do when silence makes them nervous. "She's family to the whole operation, you know. Her father built Hillary House from one location. She spent her whole life thinking the world owes her the same respect he earned. It's not right. But that's who she is." "That's not really my concern," Julian said finally. His voice was calm, but there was an edge under it now, quiet and cold. "My concern is the fund." Parker straightened up fast, grateful for the change of subject. Right, of course. The numbers are strong, honestly, Mr. River. The new locations are performing well. The investor returns for Q3 are exactly where we projected. I want to see the full breakdown, not the summary. Line items. Something flickered across Parker's face, just for a second. Gone before Julian could be sure he'd seen it at all. "Of course," Parker said. "I'll have my team send it over." They stood there a moment, the awkwardness of the night still hanging between them. Parker shifted his weight, glancing back toward the restaurant like he was worried someone might be listening. "Look," Parker said, lowering his voice, "I want to apologize again. Properly. What happened in there? It shouldn't have happened. Full stop. And honestly, it makes me glad, in a strange way, that the board pushed so hard on your contract terms when you first came in. Those protections you insisted on, I remember thinking they were excessive at the time. Overkill. But moments like tonight remind me why an investor like you doesn't just hand over trust blindly." Julian's eyes sharpened, just slightly. "What protections?" Parker waved a hand, already trying to walk the comment back. "Nothing. I just mean your contract. The unusual clauses. The board agreed to all of it. Obviously, we don't have a problem with it. I just meant it in a good way. That you're careful. That you protect yourself." Julian didn't respond right away. He filed the comment away, the way he filed away every piece of information that didn't quite add up. He'd signed that contract years ago. He remembered the broad strokes, his usual terms, the ones his lawyers always built in. But unusual. That word sat strange in his chest. "Send me the full contract along with the breakdown," Julian said. "I want to review everything." "Of course. Absolutely." Parker nodded too many times, the way people do when they're eager for a conversation to be over. "Again, Mr. River, I really am sorry about tonight. It won't happen again." Julian gave a small nod and turned toward his car, waiting at the curb. Inside the restaurant, the dining room had mostly settled back into its rhythm, though the whispers hadn't stopped. Victoria sat rigid in her chair, barely touching the wine she'd caused a scene over. When she finally stood, she didn't head back to her table. She caught Donald's eye across the room and jerked her head toward the hallway near the kitchen. A silent command. Donald followed, bracing himself. Once they were alone, away from the guests, Victoria's composure cracked into something sharper. "Not one word," she said, voice low and furious. "Not to anyone. Not the staff, not the press, not my father. If I hear that tonight, left this building in any version other than a misunderstanding that was quickly resolved, I will make sure you regret it. Do you understand me?" Donald kept his face still. "I understand." "Good." She smoothed the front of her blouse like she was smoothing over the whole night itself. "This doesn't happen again." She walked away without waiting for a response, heels clicking against the floor. Outside, Julian slid into the back seat of his car. As it pulled away from the curb, he looked back once at the glowing windows of Hillary House, Parker's words still turning over in his mind. Unusual protections. He hadn't thought about that contract in years. He was about to think about nothing else. 2 days passed before the rumor reached Julian. He was at his office, a quiet space on the 30th floor, reviewing routine paperwork for the fund. Nothing urgent, nothing that should have taken up much of his morning. Then his assistant, Marta, knocked on his open door, phone still in her hand. "You should probably hear this from me first," she said. Julian set down his pen. "Hear what?" "People are talking. About the dinner at Hillary House." Julian leaned back in his chair. He hadn't told anyone the details of that night. Not out of shame, but because it hadn't seemed worth repeating. He'd assumed it was over. A bad moment. Handled. Done. "Talking how?" Marta hesitated. "Not the way it actually happened." She explained what she'd heard secondhand, from a friend who sat on a nonprofit board with several of Victoria's donors. According to the story going around, a strange man had cornered Victoria Hillary at her own family's restaurant, gotten aggressive with her in front of her guests, and frightened her badly enough that she'd needed Parker to step in and calm things down. Julian sat very still while she talked. "She's telling people I threatened her," he said. It wasn't a question. Not in those exact words, but close enough that people are filling in the blanks themselves. Julian felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, but something colder. Frustration, maybe, or recognition. He'd underestimated her. He'd walked away from that restaurant thinking the truth spoke for itself, that a room full of witnesses would be enough to keep the story straight. He'd forgotten that people like Victoria didn't need the truth. They just needed a story people wanted to believe. The phone on his desk rang before he could think it through further. It was Grant, an old colleague who ran a private equity shop downtown. Someone Julian had worked with on and off for over a decade. "Julian, hey, everything okay? I heard something happened at Hillary House the other night." "What did you hear?" Grant's voice turned careful, the way people talk when they're testing water they already suspect is too hot. "That there was some kind of confrontation. That you got into it with the Hillary daughter." "She got into it with me," Julian said flatly. "She thought I was a waiter, snapped her fingers at me and demanded wine. When I didn't jump, she threatened to have me fired. From a restaurant I don't work at." There was a pause on the line. "That's not the version going around." "I'm sure it isn't." Grant didn't push further, but Julian could hear the hesitation in his voice before they hung up. The kind of hesitation that meant doubt had already found a foothold, even with someone who'd known Julian for years. If Grant had questions, others would too. And people like Victoria's donor circle, old money, tight social webs, didn't need much to turn a rumor into a reputation. Parker called an hour later, and Julian expected an apology, or at least an acknowledgement. Instead, Parker mostly talked around the subject, focused on smoothing things over for the fund's image, mentioning nothing about correcting the stories circulating through Victoria's circle. He seemed more worried about protecting the Hillary name than protecting the truth, and by extension, protecting Julian's. That told Julian everything he needed to know about where Parker's loyalties actually sat. After the call ended, Julian sat alone in his office for a long moment, the city stretching out below his window, ordinary and indifferent to what had just been set in motion. He thought about Parker's comment from 2 nights ago. Unusual protections. He thought about the discrepancy between what he'd witnessed with his own eyes and the story now spreading through rooms he'd never even entered. If Victoria was willing to lie this easily, this fast, to protect her own image, what else was she willing to bury? He picked up his phone and called his legal team. "I want a full review of the Hillary House financials," he said. "Everything tied to the fund's expansion capital. Start quiet. I don't want Parker knowing yet." He hung up, and for the first time since that night at the restaurant, Julian felt something settle in him. Not anger exactly, but resolve. Victoria had decided who he was before she ever looked at his face. Now he was going to make sure she couldn't look away. The following week, Julian's legal and financial team got to work. He'd used his investor access rights before, but never like this. Never with the quiet, deliberate purpose of finding something wrong. His lead analyst, a sharp young woman named Sabrina, called him on a Wednesday afternoon. "We found something," she said. "It's not huge, but it's strange." Julian sat forward. Strange how? The expansion budget for the last 3 Hillary House locations doesn't match up. On paper, construction costs and vendor payments are logged at one number. But when we cross-reference against public permits and contractor filings for those same builds, the real costs come in lower. Noticeably lower. How much lower? Hundreds of thousands per location so far. Could be more once we dig deeper. It's not the kind of gap you get from rounding errors or bad bookkeeping. It's consistent. Same pattern, project after project. Julian felt his jaw tighten. Where's the difference going? That's what we don't know yet. It's routed through a few shell vendors, companies that don't show up anywhere else, no other clients, no real footprint. Could be nothing. Could be someone skimming. Julian thought of Parker's face outside Hillary House that night. Flustered, over-explaining, too eager to talk about anything except the numbers Julian had actually asked to see. "Keep digging," Julian said, quietly. "I don't want Parker getting wind of this until we know exactly what we're looking at." Understood. He hung up and sat with it for a long moment. A part of him wanted to call Parker directly, lay the discrepancy on the table, demand answers, but his instincts told him to wait. Rushing this would only give Parker time to clean it up, bury it deeper, come back with an explanation polished enough to sound reasonable. Better to build the case first. Quietly. Completely. That evening, as Julian was leaving his office, his phone buzzed with a message from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. River. This is Donald Owen. I was the floor manager at Hillary House the night of the incident. I got your contact through a friend who works event staffing. I know this might seem strange, but I have information I think you should hear. Would you be willing to meet?" Julian read the message twice, standing on the sidewalk outside his building, the evening crowd moving past him. He remembered Donald clearly, the man who'd tried to step in that night, tried to stop Victoria before things got worse, and got cut down for it just as fast as Julian had. He remembered the look on Donald's face, too. Not just embarrassment, fear. The kind of fear that came from someone who knew exactly what it cost to speak up in a place like that. Julian typed back a short reply. "I'm willing to meet. Somewhere away from the restaurant." The response came fast, like Donald had been waiting with his phone in hand. "Thank you. I understand if this is a risk for you too. I just think you should know what you walked into that night wasn't a one-time thing. Julian stared at the message for a long moment. Wasn't a one-time thing. The words settled heavy in his chest, confirming something he'd already started to suspect. That Victoria's cruelty wasn't a single bad night, a rare loss of temper under pressure. It was a pattern. And if Donald had reached out this fast, risking his own job to do it, then whatever he had to say mattered enough to be worth that risk. Julian typed a time and place. A small coffee shop across town, far from Hillary House and far from anyone who might recognize either of them together. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. I'll be there, Donald wrote back. Julian slid his phone into his pocket and looked up at the darkening sky, the city lights beginning to flicker on around him. 2 days ago, this had felt like an isolated insult. One bad night, one rude woman, an apology he hadn't even really gotten. Now it was starting to look like something much bigger. A pattern of financial discrepancies inside the fund, a pattern of mistreatment inside the restaurant, and somewhere at the center of both, the same names kept surfacing: Victoria Hillary and the man who managed her family's money. Julian didn't know yet how deep it went, but for the first time since that night, he had the sense that Victoria's snapped fingers had set something in motion she never could have predicted. And there was no calling it back now. The coffee shop was small and mostly empty, tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered bookstore, far enough from Hillary House that neither of them worried about being seen. Julian arrived first and took a table near the back, facing the door. Donald walked in a few minutes later, glancing around before he sat down. He looked different out of his uniform, younger somehow, and more tired. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup like he needed something to hold on to. "Thank you for meeting me," Donald said. "I know this is strange. Reaching out like this." "You said what happened that night wasn't a one-time thing," Julian said. "I want to know what you meant." Donald nodded slowly, like he'd been rehearsing this moment the whole drive over. He pulled out his phone and set it on the table between them. "I've worked at Hillary House for almost 2 years," he said. "Floor manager for the last one. And for most of that time, I've been keeping records, photos, screenshots, copies of memos I probably shouldn't have kept." "Records of what?" Donald unlocked his phone and slid it across the table. "Look for yourself." Julian scrolled through what he found. The first image was a memo, printed on Hillary House letterhead, instructing hosts to seat certain guests away from the front windows during peak hours. No explanation given, no criteria listed, but Donald had underlined a pattern in his own notes below it. Every guest flagged this way in the reservation system that month had been black. "I started noticing it my first few months," Donald said quietly. "Small things at first. A host getting quietly told to move a table. A server getting pulled aside for not fitting the room. I told myself I was reading into it. Then it kept happening." Julian kept scrolling. Write-ups, disciplinary notices. He saw 2 names come up again and again. Employees cited for infractions that, when Julian read the details, sounded almost identical to things white staff members had done without consequence. Donald had noted the discrepancies himself. Dates and names lined up side by side in a private log he'd built over months. "Why keep all this?" Julian asked. "Why not report it?" Donald's jaw tightened. "Report it to who? Victoria? Her father built this place, and she runs the floor like she inherited more than the restaurant. Like she inherited the right to decide who belongs in it. I kept it because I didn't trust anyone above me to do anything with it. I figured someday it might matter. I just didn't know when or how." Julian looked up from the phone. "And after what happened to me?" "After what happened to you," Donald said. "She pulled me aside and told me if word got out, in any version other than a misunderstanding, she'd make sure I regretted it. That's when I decided. If she was willing to threaten me over one bad night with an investor, I didn't want to imagine what she'd do to protect the rest of this from ever coming out. Julian sat back, letting it settle. What happened to him wasn't isolated. It wasn't even the worst of it. It was one visible moment in a much longer, quieter pattern. The kind that usually never made it past a locked phone and a scared employee too afraid to speak. "I want copies of everything," Julian said. "Every memo, every write-up, every note you've made." Donald hesitated only a second before nodding. "I figured you'd ask. I already put it together, actually. A full folder. I wasn't sure who else I could trust with it." He pulled a small flash drive from his jacket pocket and set it on the table between them. Julian looked at it for a long moment before picking it up. "This could cost you your job. You understand that?" "I understand a lot of things could cost me my job," Donald said. "But somebody finally sat still long enough to listen. I'm not walking away from that." Julian slid the drive into his own pocket, and something settled between them. Not quite trust yet, but the start of it. An understanding that they were now tangled together in something bigger than either of them had planned to be part of. "I'll be in touch," Julian said, standing. "Be careful. Don't do anything that draws attention until you hear from me." Donald nodded, watching him go. Outside, Julian walked back toward his car, with the drive weighing heavier in his pocket than its size should have allowed. The financial discrepancies his team had found were one thread. Donald's records were another. Somewhere, both threads ran back to the same two people, and Julian was starting to see exactly how they connected. Leona Lane had been trying to get an interview with Julian River for over a year. She'd emailed his office twice, called once, and gotten the same polite non-answer both times. Mr. River doesn't do press. So when his assistant called her out of nowhere and asked if she was free to meet that week, Leona nearly asked if it was some kind of mistake. She met him at a small restaurant far from downtown, nothing like Hillary House. No white tablecloths, no snapping fingers, just a diner booth and coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. "I have to admit," Leona said, sliding into the booth across from him, "this isn't what I expected. Last year you told my editor you weren't interested in talking to journalists. Ever." "I'm not," Julian said. "This isn't an interview." "Then what is it?" Julian slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed summaries of the financial discrepancies his team had found. The mismatched construction costs, the shell vendors, the pattern repeating across 3 different Hillary House locations. Leona's eyes moved fast down the page, her journalist instincts kicking in before she'd even finished her coffee. "Where did you get this?" "My team pulled it through my investor access rights. It's real. It's verified. But I need you to hold it. Not publish yet." Leona looked up at him, guarded now. "You're telling me you have documented evidence of financial fraud tied to Vinton Capital, and you want me to sit on it? For now, I have more coming. Once I have the full picture, you'll get everything, all of it, on the record, whenever you're ready to run it. But if this goes out too early, whoever's behind it gets a chance to bury the rest before I can prove the full pattern." Leona sat back, studying him. She'd covered enough stories about private equity, enough stories about powerful men protecting other powerful men, to know when someone was handing her a real story instead of a distraction. This felt real. "Why me?" she asked. "You turned me down a year ago." "Because a year ago I didn't have anything worth saying. Now I do. And I remember you were the only reporter who reached out asking about ethics in this industry, instead of just asking about returns." Leona allowed herself the smallest smile. "Careful, Mr. River. That almost sounded like a compliment. Don't get used to it." She flipped through the pages again, more slowly this time, already building the shape of the story in her head. Shell vendors, mismatched costs, a fund quietly bleeding money while its public face collected donor applause at galas. Whose fund is this tied to specifically? Whose name sits on top of this? Parker Vinton. He runs Vinton Capital. He manages the Hillary Family Trust. Leona's eyebrows lifted. Hillary, as in Hillary House. Julian nodded once. There's already a rumor going around about you and Victoria Hillary, Leona said carefully. Some kind of confrontation at her restaurant. That rumor isn't the true version, Julian said. But it's connected to why I'm here talking to you now, instead of ignoring it. Leona leaned forward, sensing there was more beneath the surface than a financial story. Connected how? Julian hesitated only a moment before deciding she needed at least part of the full picture to understand what she was walking into. He told her the short version, the incident at the restaurant, the fabricated rumor Victoria had spread afterward, and what he now suspected sat underneath it. A pattern of financial irregularities and a pattern of mistreatment, both running through the same family, the same restaurant group, the same fund. When he finished, Leona sat quietly for a moment, turning it over. That's not one story, she said finally. That's two stories tangled into one very ugly picture. That's why I need you to wait, Julian said. I want it airtight before it goes anywhere. Leona closed the folder and slid it into her bag. I'll wait. But Julian, if this is what I think it is, people like the Hillarys don't sit quiet once they sense a threat. They move fast, and they move dirty. You should be ready for that. I am. Leona studied him a moment longer, like she was trying to decide if that confidence was real or just something he told himself. Then she nodded, stood, and reached out to shake his hand. Call me the second you're ready, she said. And Julian, watch your back. People like her don't lose gracefully. Victoria didn't bother knocking. She pushed through the door of Parker's office at Vinton Capital like she owned the building, which, in a way, she believed she did. Parker looked up from his desk, startled. Victoria, I didn't have you on my calendar. I don't need to be on your calendar, she snapped, dropping into the chair across from him without being asked. I need you to fix this, now. Fix what, exactly? You know exactly what. The rumors from that night still haven't died down the way I need them to. My donors are whispering. My father's old board members keep asking me pointed little questions about my temper. Do you know how humiliating that is? I built the story. I controlled it. And it's still not enough because that man is still sitting there with access to everything. Parker folded his hands on his desk, choosing his words carefully. Julian River is our largest single investor, Victoria. I don't care what he is, she cut him off. I care that every time I walk into a room, I feel like people are picturing me standing over him, snapping my fingers like some kind of monster. He humiliated me in my own restaurant. He didn't do anything, Parker said, quieter now. You did that yourself. Victoria's eyes flashed. Excuse me? Parker caught himself, backpedaling fast. I only mean, the situation got out of hand quickly. That's all. She leaned forward, voice low and cold. Let me remind you of something, Parker. My family's trust is the largest single account this fund manages. My father built the relationship that keeps this whole operation running smoothly. If I go to him, if I tell him this fund can't be trusted to protect our family's interests, how long do you think you keep your office, let alone your job? Parker's jaw tightened. He said nothing. That's what I thought, Victoria said. So here's what you're going to do. Julian River has access to our books because of his stake in the fund. I want that access gone. Find a way to buy him out. Early. Quietly. Whatever it costs, pay it. I don't want him anywhere near this fund's records anymore. That's not how it works, Parker said, though his voice had lost most of its conviction. The board would need to approve an early buyback, and even then, we'd need grounds. Find grounds, Victoria snapped. You're clever, Parker. That's why my father trusts you. Figure it out. I don't care if it's a lowball offer. I don't care if he's furious about it. I want him out before he starts asking questions he shouldn't be asking." Parker sat still for a long moment, staring at the papers on his desk. The same papers that, if anyone looked closely enough, would eventually reveal the discrepancies his own hands had quietly created over the past several years. Discrepancies he'd told himself were temporary, manageable, a means to an end that never seemed to actually end. If Julian's team kept digging, kept pulling threads, it wouldn't just be Victoria's reputation on the line. It would be his freedom. "I'll handle it," Parker said finally. Victoria sat back, satisfied, like she'd expected nothing less. "Good. I knew you'd see reason." She stood, smoothing her jacket, already moving on to the next item on whatever mental list ran her days. "And Parker, I don't want to hear his name again unless it's to tell me he's gone." She left without another word, heels clicking down the hallway outside his office. Parker sat alone for a long time after the door closed, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. He thought about the shell vendors, the inflated construction costs, the money that had quietly moved through accounts that didn't officially exist anywhere but on paper, funneled out over years, always just small enough not to draw attention. Until now. He opened a blank document and began drafting the buyback proposal, his fingers moving faster than his conscience could keep up with. He told himself it wasn't really about protecting himself. It was about protecting the fund's biggest client, protecting the relationship, protecting the business. He almost believed it. By the time the office had emptied out for the night, Parker was still there, the glow of his monitor the only light left on that floor, finishing a proposal designed to strip Julian River of his access before Julian could find out exactly how much there was left to find. Over the following week, Julian's team worked with a quiet, relentless focus. Sabrina called him twice a day now, each time with another piece of the picture filled in. The shell vendors tied to the inflated construction costs all traced back to a small handful of shared addresses, office suites that turned out to be nothing more than mailboxes in a building downtown. No employees, no real operations. Every dollar routed through them eventually looped back, through a chain of transfers, to accounts connected to Parker Vinton personally. "It's not a mistake," Sabrina told him. "It's not sloppy bookkeeping. Somebody built this system on purpose, and they built it to be hard to trace, unless you already knew what you were looking for." Julian sat with that for a long moment. "How much are we talking, total?" "Conservatively? 12 million, spread out over 4 years. Could be more once we finish the last 2 properties. $12 million, quietly bled out of a fund that answered to investors who trusted Parker with their money. Investors like Julian himself. It confirmed what Julian had already started to suspect the night Parker let that comment slip outside Hillary House. Unusual protections. Parker hadn't just resented those terms because they were inconvenient. He'd resented them because Julian, without even knowing it yet, had built himself a door Parker couldn't quietly lock. Julian called Donald that same afternoon. "I need to ask you something serious," Julian said, once they were both on the line. "If this goes where I think it's going, I may need you to speak on the record. Testify, if it comes to that. About what you documented. The memos, the write-ups, all of it." There was a pause on the other end. Julian could hear the weight of the decision sitting on Donald in that silence. "I already gave you copies of everything," Donald said finally. "I wouldn't have done that if I wasn't prepared to stand behind it." "Yes, I'll testify." "It could cost you your job," Julian said again, wanting to be sure Donald understood exactly what he was agreeing to. "I've thought about that every day since I sent you that first message," Donald said. "I'm not backing out now." Julian thanked him and hung up, feeling the shape of the case solidify around him. the financial trail Sabrina's team had built, and the human pattern Donald had documented, both converging on the same two names. Parker's greed had opened the door. Victoria's cruelty had walked Julian straight through it. He called Leona next. "I have enough," he told her. Real evidence. Enough to bring to the fund's board and force an emergency audit. Donald's agreed to testify. "Once the audit is confirmed, you will have everything to publish." "I've been ready," Leona said. "Just say the word." "Not yet. I want the board vote locked in first. I don't want to move too early and give them room to maneuver." "Understood. But Julian, the second this becomes real to them, they're going to fight. Hard. People like the Hillarys don't go down quiet." "I know," Julian said. "That's why I want everything airtight before I make the first move." That evening, Julian sat alone in his office, reviewing the full case laid out across his desk. Sabrina's financial trail on one side, Donald's documented pattern on the other, and in the middle, the connecting thread that tied it all together. Parker Vinton, protecting the Hillary family's money and their reputation because his own survival depended on both staying hidden. He thought about calling for the board meeting that night, but decided against it. Better to move with precision than speed. He instructed Sabrina to finalize the documentation into something clean, something undeniable, something that couldn't be argued away in a boardroom full of people looking for reasons to look away. Before he left the office, he sent a short message to his legal team. "Prepare the request for an emergency board session. I want it filed by end of week." He set his phone down and looked out over the city lights, feeling for the first time since that humiliating night at Hillary House that the balance had genuinely tipped in his favor. He had the money trail. He had a witness willing to speak. He had a journalist standing by. What he didn't have yet, though he wouldn't find out until it was almost too late, was any idea of how fast Victoria and Parker were already moving against him. By the end of the week, everything was ready. Julian sat in his office early that morning, the emergency board session scheduled for the following day, going through the final documents one last time. Sabrina had compiled the financial trail into a clean, undeniable timeline. Dates, transfers, shell vendor addresses, all of it laid out so clearly that even someone unfamiliar with fund accounting could follow the money straight to Parker's door. Beside it sat Donald's documentation, organized the same way. Memos, write-ups, dates lined up next to names, showing the pattern too consistent to be coincidence. "This is solid," Sabrina told him over the phone that morning. "I've walked 3 separate board members through the numbers informally, just to gauge reactions. 2 of them were stunned. One of them already said she'd vote to force the audit without hesitation. And the third? Cautious, but not opposed. I think once he sees the full picture tomorrow, he'll come around." Julian felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying since that night at Hillary House. For the first time in weeks, the path forward looked clear. Straightforward, even. Tomorrow, the board would hear the evidence. They'd vote to force an emergency audit. Parker would be suspended pending investigation. And once that happened, Leona could publish everything. The fraud, the discrimination, the retaliation Victoria had already threatened against anyone who spoke up. He called Donald next to confirm his testimony was still on for the meeting. "I'm ready," Donald said. His voice was steady, though Julian could hear the effort behind that steadiness. "I've gone over what I want to say probably 50 times this week. I just want it to be over, one way or another." "It will be tomorrow," Julian said. "Just tell the truth. That's all anyone's going to need." He called Leona last. "Tomorrow's the day," he told her. "The board votes on the emergency audit. The second it's confirmed, you're clear to run everything." "I've had the draft ready for 3 days," Leona said. "Just waiting on you to give the word. You'll have it by tomorrow evening." Good, Leona said. Then, after a pause, Julian, for what it's worth, I think you built this the right way. Slow, careful. A lot of people would have gone straight to the press the second they got humiliated like that. You didn't. You made sure it couldn't be argued away. Julian allowed himself a small, tired smile. Ask me again after tomorrow. That evening, he sat at his desk long after Sabrina and the rest of his team had gone home, looking over the documents one final time by the glow of his desk lamp. $12 million in diverted funds. A year and a half of documented discrimination. A witness willing to testify. A journalist ready to publish. A board already leaning in his favor before he'd even walked into the room. For the first time since Victoria had snapped her fingers at him in that crowded dining room, Julian let himself believe it was almost over. That tomorrow, the truth would finally outweigh the story Victoria had spent weeks trying to spin in her favor. That Parker's carefully hidden fraud was about to collapse under its own weight. That Donald, who had risked everything to come forward, was finally going to be heard by people with the power to do something about it. He gathered the documents into a single folder, sealed it, and set it on the corner of his desk, ready for the morning. He sent one last message to his legal team before shutting down his computer for the night. Everything's set. See everyone at 9. Then he turned off the lamp and left the office, the hallway quiet and dark around him, the city humming faintly outside the windows. He drove home with the kind of tired satisfaction that comes after weeks of careful, patient work. The sense that tomorrow, finally, the balance would tip all the way in his favor, permanently. He had no way of knowing that across town, in a very different office, Parker Vinton was awake long past midnight too, not preparing for tomorrow's board meeting, but working frantically to make sure it never happened the way Julian expected, and that Victoria, in her own home, phone pressed to her ear, was already 3 calls deep into a plan designed to make sure Donald never made it to that meeting at all. Julian went to sleep, believing the hardest part was already behind him. He was wrong. Parker hadn't slept. He sat in his office long after midnight, 3 lawyers on a conference call, all of them scrambling to build something fast enough to matter before 9 o'clock the next morning. His hands shook slightly as he scrolled through Julian's original contract, the one he'd complained about years ago, the one with the unusual protections he'd never fully understood the weight of until now. "We can't touch the audit clause directly," one of the lawyers said through the speaker. "It's airtight, but we don't need to touch it. We just need to freeze his standing long enough to delay the vote." "How?" Parker asked. "The incident at the restaurant. We reframe it. File a formal complaint alleging River behaved aggressively toward a Hillary House employee. Toward Victoria herself. Claim it's under review. That's enough grounds to suspend his board voting rights pending investigation, at least temporarily." Parker closed his eyes. It was a lie, and he knew it was a lie, and he signed off on it anyway, because the alternative was watching everything he'd built, and stolen, collapse in a boardroom in 8 hours. "Do it," he said. "File it tonight." Across town, Victoria sat in her home office, phone pressed to her ear, her voice sharp and businesslike despite the hour. "I don't care what excuse you use," she told her head of HR. "Performance issues. Attendance. I don't care. Donald Owen is terminated, effective immediately, and I want the paperwork dated to make it look clean. Tonight. Ma'am, it's nearly 1 in the morning. Then I suggest you get started." She hung up before he could argue further and immediately dialed her family's law firm, the one that had handled every uncomfortable situation for the Hillarys for 3 generations. "There's a journalist," she said, once she had the senior partner on the line. "Leona Lane. She's sitting on a story that could damage the family name. I want an injunction filed against her outlet before morning. Defamation grounds. I don't care what you have to stretch to make it stick. Just get it filed. By the time the sun came up, all 3 moves had landed. Julian arrived at his office just after 7, coffee in hand, expecting to spend the next 2 hours doing a final review before the board session. Instead, Sabrina was waiting for him at the door, her face pale. "You need to see this," she said, handing him a printed notice. Julian read it, standing in the hallway. A formal complaint, filed overnight, alleging aggressive conduct toward Hillary House staff, reframing the incident from Chapter 1 entirely, twisting Julian into the aggressor. Attached to it, a temporary suspension of his board voting rights, pending review. "They filed this at 11 last night," Sabrina said. "The board session this morning. Legally, you can't participate in the vote while this is under review." Julian felt something cold settle in his chest. "Get Donald on the phone," Sabrina's face told him before she said a word. "I already tried. His number's been disconnected." "No, wait. It's active. But he's not answering. I called Hillary House directly. They told me he no longer works there. Terminated last night." Julian's jaw tightened. "And Leona?" His phone buzzed before Sabrina could answer. A text from Leona herself. "Injunction filed against the outlet an hour ago. Defamation grounds, tied to an unnamed source claiming reputational harm. I can't run it. Not through here. Not yet." Julian stood in the hallway, the printed notice still in his hand, the weight of the last 12 hours settling over him all at once. His voting rights, frozen, his witness, fired and unreachable. His journalist, gagged by a court order filed in the dead of night. 3 moves. 1 night. And every single one of them had landed exactly where it needed to, before Julian had even known there was a fight happening while he slept. He walked into his office and sat down slowly. The folder he'd prepared the night before still sealed on the corner of his desk. Suddenly useless, without a board that could legally hear him, a witness who could speak, or a journalist who could publish. Sabrina stood in the doorway, waiting for direction. But for the first time in weeks, Julian didn't have an immediate answer. He thought about Victoria's face outside the restaurant, humiliated and furious. He thought about Parker's nervous apology on the sidewalk. He hadn't underestimated their cruelty. He'd underestimated how fast and how far they were willing to move to protect themselves once they felt cornered. He sat back in his chair, staring at the frozen board notice, and forced himself to breathe. Somewhere in everything he already had, there had to be a way through this. He just had to find it before they buried him completely. Julian didn't leave his office that morning. He called his legal team in instead, all of them in person, gathered around the conference table with the frozen board notice sitting in the center, like something radioactive. "Walk me through this again," Julian said. Slowly. "What exactly does this filing actually freeze?" His lead attorney, a sharp older man named Foster who'd handled Julian's contracts for over a decade, spread out a copy of the original investment agreement. On its face, it suspends your board voting rights pending review of the incident. But, Julian, this notice assumes your rights as an investor all flow through standard voting procedure. They don't. Not entirely. Julian sat forward. "What do you mean?" Foster flipped to a section near the back of the contract. One Julian hadn't looked at closely in years. "You remember when you first invested. You insisted on certain protections before you'd sign. Conditions most investors never bother asking for. I remember the broad strokes. I didn't design the clauses myself. That was you and the team." "Right. And one of them was this." Foster tapped the page. "An emergency audit trigger. If there's credible evidence of misconduct by fund leadership, financial misconduct, or discriminatory conduct by leadership or by entities the fund controls, you have the standing right to trigger a mandatory audit. Not a request. Not a vote. A trigger. And critically, Julian, this right isn't tied to your standard voting privileges at all. It's a separate, independent clause. It can't be frozen by a complaint about unrelated conduct because it was written specifically to survive exactly this kind of situation. Julian stared at the page, letting that settle. Parker's comment outside Hillary House came rushing back, sharp and clear. Those protections you insisted on. I remember thinking they were excessive at the time. Parker hadn't been making idle conversation that night. He'd been circling something he was afraid of, even then, without fully realizing how afraid he should have been. So they can freeze my vote, Julian said slowly. But they can't freeze this. Not legally. Not if the evidence is real. Foster closed the folder. And from what Sabrina's shown me, it's real. Relief moved through Julian, careful and controlled, not yet allowing himself to feel it fully. What do we need to trigger it? Documented evidence, formally submitted. Financial misconduct. We have that in detail. And discriminatory conduct tied to fund-controlled entities, which Hillary House is, given the fund's ownership stake. Foster paused. That's where it gets complicated. Our strongest evidence there was Donald Owen's testimony. And he's gone. Julian's stomach tightened, the momentary relief souring fast. They fired him specifically to take that off the table. Looks that way. Julian sat back, thinking hard. Then something surfaced, a detail from weeks ago, easy to overlook in the flood of everything since. He looked at Sabrina. The flash drive, the one Donald gave me at the coffee shop. Do we still have everything on it? Sabrina's eyes widened slightly. We copied it into the case file the same day. Every memo, every write-up. All of it's already documented and dated in our records. Then his firing doesn't erase the evidence, Julian said, the pieces falling into place. It just proves retaliation. He handed over copies weeks before they let him go, which means everything he documented survives, whether he's employed there or not. And the timing of his termination, right after I requested his testimony, right before the board session, that's not a coincidence anyone reasonable is going to buy. Foster nodded slowly, a small, grim smile forming. That actually strengthens the case. It shows a pattern of retaliation on top of the original misconduct. Julian felt the shape of a path opening in front of him, narrow but real. Prepare the paperwork to trigger the audit clause, formally, today. I want it filed the moment it's ready. It'll take a few hours to assemble properly, Foster said. We want it airtight. No room for them to challenge the filing on a technicality. Take the time you need, but move fast. As the team dispersed to begin drafting, Julian picked up his phone and dialed Leona. They got to Donald and filed an injunction against your outlet, he said, before she could speak. I know. I'm not calling to apologize. I'm calling because I think there's still a way through this, and I need to know, is there any way around the injunction? Any outlet it doesn't cover? There was a pause on the line, and then Leona's voice came back, careful but alert. Actually, she said, there might be. There might be, Leona said again, and Julian could hear her moving, papers shuffling in the background like she was already digging through something on her desk. The injunction was filed against my employer specifically. The outlet's name is right there on the court order. It covers anything published under their banner. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning it doesn't cover me personally, outside of that relationship. I freelance on the side, Julian. Have for years. There's an independent financial newsletter. Small, but respected in the right circles. The kind of place serious investors and regulators actually read. I've published there under my own byline before, completely separate from my main employer. Different masthead, different legal entity entirely. Julian felt something shift in his chest, the narrow path widening just slightly. Would the injunction reach that far? It shouldn't. Legally, An injunction naming one publication doesn't automatically extend to work I do independently for a completely unrelated outlet. Their lawyers would have to file a brand new action against the newsletter directly, and that takes time. Time they don't have if we move fast. How fast can you have the story ready? I've had the draft sitting finished for days, Leona said. I just need the final piece, confirmation that the audit's been triggered, and anything new on the retaliation against Donald. Give me that, and I can have it live within hours of you giving the word. Julian let out a slow breath, the first real breath he felt like he'd taken since reading the frozen board notice that morning. The retaliation angle is strong. Donald gave me copies of everything weeks before they fired him. The timing alone tells its own story. They let him go right after I requested his testimony, right before the board session. That's not something they can spin away easily. Send me everything you can, Leona said. Dates, documentation, the timeline of his firing next to the timeline of the board complaint. I want this airtight before it goes anywhere. One shot, Julian. We don't get to walk it back if they find a hole in it. You'll have it by this afternoon. He hung up and immediately called Foster, checking on the audit paperwork. How close? Close, Foster said. Another hour, maybe 2. We're building the retaliation argument alongside the original misconduct claims, exactly like you asked. It's strong, Julian. Genuinely strong. While the team finished the filing, Julian sat at his desk and composed a short, careful email to every member of the fund's board and its largest investors, informing them that an emergency meeting would be called within 48 hours to address serious findings related to fund leadership. He kept it vague on purpose, enough to demand attention, not enough to let anyone start covering their tracks before he was ready. He thought carefully about where to hold it. Parker's office felt too small, too easily controlled. A neutral conference room felt too quiet, too easy to keep contained. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the same room, the same donor circle, the same people who had watched Victoria humiliate him weeks ago, the same people who needed to watch this end, too. He called the events coordinator at Hillary House directly, using his standing as majority stakeholder in the fund that financed the building itself, and reserved the flagship dining room for a private investor meeting 2 days later. The staff on the phone had no idea what was coming. Neither yet did Victoria. By early evening, Foster called with confirmation. The audit triggers filed, formally submitted, time-stamped, airtight. It's done, Julian. As of this moment, you have the legal right to force this into the open, regardless of whatever complaint they filed against your voting rights. Relief moved through Julian, quiet but real. He thanked Foster and hung up, then forwarded the filing confirmation straight to Leona. It's official, he wrote. Audit triggered. I'm calling an emergency investor meeting in 2 days at Hillary House. I want your story to go live the same moment I walk into that room. Leona's reply came back within minutes. Understood. I'll have it ready to publish the second you give the word. This is going to be big, Julian. Are you sure about the location? I'm sure, he wrote back. She humiliated me in that room. It's only fair she watches this happen in the exact same place. He set his phone down and looked out over the darkening city, the pieces finally aligning after a day that had started in near collapse. Parker and Victoria had struck first, fast and brutal, believing they'd buried him before he could even begin to fight back. They had no idea he was still standing. 2 days later, Julian walked back into Hillary House. The dining room looked almost exactly as it had the night everything started. Same white tablecloths, same low golden light, same donor circle gathered around Victoria's usual table, dressed for another evening of pleasant, empty conversation. She sat at the head of it, unaware that the room had already been reserved, weeks in advance in her own family's calendar, for something far more consequential than a dinner. Parker stood near the bar when Julian walked in, his face pale, jaw tight. He knew what was coming. He'd known for 2 days, ever since the audit trigger notice had landed in his inbox, official and undeniable. Julian didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room, the same spot near the bar where he'd once waited quietly for Parker, while Victoria snapped her fingers at him like he was furniture. "Thank you all for coming," Julian said, his voice calm but carrying easily across the room. "I know this meeting was called with little notice. I promise it's worth your time." Victoria's smile faltered as she registered the location, the audience, the deliberate echo of that first night. Her eyes moved to Parker, searching for reassurance she wasn't going to get. Julian laid it out plainly, without theatrics, because the truth didn't need theatrics to land. He explained the financial discrepancies his team had uncovered. The shell vendors, the inflated construction costs, the $12 million quietly diverted over 4 years, all traced back to accounts connected to Parker Vinton personally. He explained the emergency audit clause, legally triggered 2 days earlier, now formally forcing an independent review of the fund's leadership. Then he turned to the second thread. "This fund controls Hillary House," Julian said, "which means its conduct falls under the same audit. I have documented evidence, memos, disciplinary records, a consistent pattern, showing systemic discrimination against employees and guests at this restaurant, spanning more than a year. That evidence was compiled by a former floor manager here, Donald Owen, who was terminated last week, immediately after I requested he testify to the board." Gasps moved through the room. A few donors exchanged uneasy glances. Victoria's face had gone rigid, her knuckles white against her wine glass. "That's outrageous," Victoria said, standing fast, her voice sharp with panic dressed up as anger. "You're twisting a routine staffing decision into some kind of conspiracy." "The timing isn't routine," Julian said evenly. "And it's not just my word. As of this evening, an independent financial newsletter has published the full story. The financial misconduct, the documented discrimination, and the retaliation against the man who tried to speak up about it." Right on cue, phones around the room began lighting up, buzzing softly against tables and inside pockets. Notifications rippling outward as Leona's story went live exactly when Julian had promised. Donors glanced down, reading in real time, faces shifting from confusion to something colder. Parker stepped forward, stammering, trying to salvage something. There are explanations for all of this. If everyone would just let me." "There aren't," Julian said, cutting through it without raising his voice. "Not for $12 million. Not for a pattern documented in writing for over a year." A member of the Hillary Family Trust Board, an older man who'd sat quietly through the entire exchange, watching Victoria's composure crumble, finally spoke. "Parker, you're removed from this fund's leadership, effective immediately. We'll be cooperating fully with the audit and any resulting investigation." Parker opened his mouth, then closed it, the weight of the room's silence answering for him. The board member turned next to Victoria, his voice quieter now, but no less final. "And given what's just gone public, tied directly to this restaurant bearing our family's name, the trust will be voting to remove you from any public role in this company. Tonight." Victoria's mouth opened, searching for the sharp, cutting words that had always worked for her before. Nothing came. For the first time since the night she'd snapped her fingers at a stranger and demanded wine, the room wasn't watching her with fear or deference. They were watching her the way she'd once looked at Julian, like she was nothing at all. Julian didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, steady, while the consequences he'd spent weeks building finally landed exactly where they belonged, in the exact room where it had all begun. 1 week later, Julian walked into Hillary House, for what he expected would be the last time in a while. The dining room looked different in daylight, quieter without the evening crowd, cleaning staff moving between tables, sunlight cutting through the windows instead of candlelight. The audit was still underway. Parker had been formally removed and referred for prosecution, his accounts frozen pending investigation. Victoria's name had been stripped from the company's public materials within 72 hours of the board vote, though what came next for her was still being decided by people far less patient with her than Julian had been. Donald was already there when Julian arrived, standing near the same spot where he'd once tried and failed to calm Victoria down before things spiraled. He looked lighter now, steadier. "They reached out yesterday," Donald said, shaking Julian's hand. "Formal reinstatement. Full back pay for the time I was out. And," he paused, like he still wasn't sure he believed it himself, "general manager of this location." "You earned it," Julian said. "Every part of it." "I almost didn't send that first message," Donald admitted. "I sat with your contact information for 2 days before I actually reached out. I kept thinking, what if nothing comes of it? What if I lose everything for nothing?" "You didn't lose anything," Julian said. "You just had to wait to see it pay off." Leona arrived a few minutes later, coffee in hand, looking pleased in the particular way journalists look when a story lands exactly as hard as they hoped it would. "The follow-up piece is getting more traction than the original," she said. "Investors pulling out of anything connected to Parker. 2 other funds are already facing questions about their own vendor relationships, thanks to people reading the story and asking uncomfortable questions of their own fund managers." "Good," Julian said. "Let them ask." They stood together for a moment, looking around the dining room that had started all of it. The table where Victoria had once snapped her fingers, the spot near the bar where Julian had stood quietly, absorbing insult after insult, without a single word in his own defense. "So what happens to the place now?" Leona asked. "Restructuring," Julian said. "New ownership terms, new leadership, starting with Donald. New oversight, so nothing like this happens quietly again." "And you?" Leona pressed. "Your name anywhere in it?" Julian shook his head. "No, I don't want it. Never did." Leona studied him for a second. "You could take credit for this, you know. Publicly. It wouldn't be wrong. You built this whole case from nothing." "I didn't do it for credit," Julian said. "I did it because a woman decided who I was before she ever looked at my face. And I wanted to make sure that decision cost her something real. Being seen was never the point." Donald nodded slowly, understanding settling over him. "You just made sure everyone else had to see it, even if you didn't need to be seen doing it. Something like that?" They talked a while longer. Practical things now, the kind of quiet, hopeful planning that comes after a long fight finally ends. New hiring practices, independent oversight for staff complaints. Donald already had ideas, ones he'd clearly been holding on to for a long time, waiting for someone to finally let him use them. Eventually, Julian said his goodbyes, promising to check in as the restructuring moved forward, though he made it clear he intended to stay mostly in the background from here on out. He walked toward the same door he'd once stood near, unnoticed, waiting for a phone call while a woman decided he wasn't worth acknowledging. This time, as he crossed the dining room, a few staff members glanced up and nodded at him, not with fear, not with forced deference, just simple recognition. He nodded back and kept walking. Outside, the afternoon sun hit the sidewalk bright and ordinary, cars moving past, the city carrying on the way it always did, indifferent to the quiet reckoning that had just finished playing out behind him. Julian didn't look back at the restaurant. He didn't need to. He'd spent his whole career being underestimated, and for the first time, he understood exactly why that had never bothered him. Being invisible had never made him powerless. It had just meant no one saw him coming. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.